The key lay on the solicitor's table in a ring of its own rust. It was iron, 9 inches long, and it opened one door on the whole Rivington estate, the one nobody in the room wanted. Margaret Vale was 31, and she had worked for wages since she was 14. Somebody near the window laughed. She was left no land, no cottage, no yearly sum, no stock, no furniture, no share of the timber money. What went home with her that afternoon was that key and a boxwood rule with brass tips that had belonged to her grandfather. She had £9 and 4 shillings put by, and she had an ice house on Rivington Hill that had stood empty for 21 years. But what Ambrose Pell did not know, when he told her to sell the walls for roadstone, was that under the 3rd flagstone from the drain, in the dark, something was still working, and it would change what every farm in that valley could carry to market. Tell me in the comments what you would have done with that key. Then come down the steps with her, because the first thing she found was not in the will. Margaret had spent 17 years learning the one thing that people who own property almost never learn, which is that owning a thing and understanding it are 2 separate skills, and only one of them can be handed down in a document. She had been a stores clerk. Before that, she had been an assistant to a housekeeper. And before that, she had been a girl who carried a chalk line for her grandfather while he set a garden wall. And in every one of those places, her work had been the same underneath the different names. In every one of them, somebody had to know exactly what was on the shelves, what it had cost, how long it would keep, and where it was going wrong. Her last place had been the house of Josiah Hargreave, a wool merchant on Micklegate in York, where she kept the stores book for a household of 19 people, and where she had been paid £22 a year with her food and a room at the top of the stairs. Mr. Hargreave died on the 9th of December, 1862, in his chair, with his boots still on. The family broke the household up before the month was out. Margaret was given a character in writing, £4 in wages owing, and the name of an agency in Leeds that placed women in the north. And by the middle of January, she was back in the valley she had come from, lodging with a widow named Peggy Shaw at 2 shillings and 6pence a week for a room over a saddler's shop. Peggy Shaw was 42 and had buried a husband who drove for the brewery. She brought Margaret bread and dripping on the days when Margaret forgot to eat, and she had opinions about the weather that she shared whether or not anybody was listening, and she has nothing else to do with this story except that she was there. The thing Margaret was good at was small and unglamorous, and had never once got her a rise in wages. She noticed when a number was wrong. At the Hargreave house she had noticed, in her 2nd year, that the kitchen was buying £11 more butter in July than it bought in November, and that the difference was not in the mouths at the table, because the mouths at the table were the same. She walked into the larder in the afternoon and put her hand flat on the shelf and understood the whole of it in about 4 seconds, because the larder was built against the south wall of the kitchen chimney, and the butter was going soft and then rancid, and then into the pig bucket, and nobody had ever written the 2 facts down on the same page. She had the larder moved to the north side of the scullery in the spring of 1859. The household saved a little under £9 a year after that, and nobody thanked her. And she wrote the saving in the back of the store's book anyway, in pencil, because that was where she wrote everything. Her grandfather had taught her that. Thomas Vale had been a mason in the valley for 40 years, a small man with a bad shoulder and a good eye, and he had given Margaret a folding rule of boxwood with brass tips on her 9th birthday. In 1841, in the yard behind his cottage with the rain coming on. Measure it twice and write it down, or all you have got is a story, he said. He died 3 years later, in the spring of 1844, and the family scattered the way families in the valley scattered, into service and into the towns, and by the time Margaret came back, there was nobody named Vale living within 6 miles of Rivington but herself. The reading of the will was on the 9th of February, 1863, in the long room at Rivington Hall, and Margaret was sent for by letter and told to attend at 11 o'clock. She had no idea why. She had spoken to the 3rd Duke of Rivington perhaps 11 times in her life, most of them before she was 15, most of them on the hill, and none of them about anything that seemed worth an hour of a solicitor's time. There were 14 people in the long room, and a fire that was not doing much. The solicitor was Reuben Sharp, 62, with a voice like a man reading a railway timetable, and he began at the top and worked down. And it took an hour and 10 minutes. The nephew Edmund took the title, and the hall and the home farms. A cousin took the Ellerbeck land and the cottages along the beck. Another cousin, Gerald Aske, who was 26 and had a habit of pulling at his cuffs, took £4,000 and the railway shares. The Duke's sister took the plate and the pictures and the use of the dower house for her life. It went on like that, in a long, even voice. And the fire went on, not doing much, and Margaret stood at the back near the door, because there were not enough chairs. Then Reuben Sharp said her name. To Margaret Vale, of this parish, he read, "The old ice house at Rivington Hill," together with the ground immediately about it. Nobody moved for a second. Then Gerald Aske laughed, one syllable of it. Before he got his hand up, somebody near the fire said something Margaret did not catch, and 2 other people smiled at it. She kept her hands where they were. She was aware of the door behind her and of the fact that her boots were wet through, and that everybody in the room now knew her name and would forget it again by dinner. Reuben Sharp had not finished. He turned the page and read the next line in exactly the same voice he had used for the railway shares. "She will know how to keep the rest of it cold," he read. He waited. He looked up over his spectacles at the room, and then down at the page. And then he said that there was no further direction, and that the words appeared in the Duke's own hand as an addition made in October of 1862, and that the addition had been properly witnessed and could not be treated as an accident. The room did not know what to do with that, so it did nothing with it. Edmund, who was now the 4th Duke and 39 years old, and had spent most of the last decade in London, asked whether the ice house had any value, and Ambrose Pell, standing at the end of the table with his hat in his hand, said that it had not. Ambrose Pell was 58 and had been steward at Rivington for 22 years. He had a long gray face, and the manner of a man who had spent his whole working life saying no to people politely. He said the ice house had taken no ice since 1842, that the roof was down over the passage, that the drain had failed, and that the only money in it was the stone, which might fetch 15 or 18 pounds if a road contractor would come up the hill for it, which he doubted. "Then let her have it," the new Duke said, and turned to the window. Afterwards, in the yard, Pell gave Margaret the key. It came out of a canvas satchel with a paper label tied to it in string, and the label said, "Ice House, Rivington Hill," and a date in 1851 when somebody had last written it. The key was heavy enough that she had to hold it in her whole hand rather than her fingers. There was a number filed into the shank, 1791, which she assumed was the year the thing had been built. "Sell the stone," Pell said. "Take the 18 pounds, and be glad of it." She asked him what the sentence in the will meant. He said that the late Duke had been unwell for a long time, and that a great many things had been written down in the last year that were better not examined. And he put his hat on and walked away across the yard, and that was the end of the conversation. Margaret walked back down to the village in the rain with the key in her pocket. And she took her grandfather's rule out of the tin box under her bed that night, and sat with it on the table in front of her, and she did not open it. She wrote 4 lines in a new book she had bought in York for 7d. She wrote the date. She wrote the words of the bequest. She wrote the words of the addition. Then she wrote, underneath, "Why me?" And she went to bed. She went up to the hill on the 11th of February, in the afternoon, with Ambrose Pell walking ahead of her, because he had insisted on coming and had made it clear on the way that he was coming, in order to be finished with it. The track ran up out of the home farmyard, and along the shoulder of the hill through wet grass, and it was not a track any more so much as a memory of one, 2 parallel dips in the turf, where the cartwheels had gone for 100 years. There was a stone gatepost lying on its side halfway up with the socket for the hinge still in it. Above them, the hill went on up to the moor edge, brown and soaking, and below them, the valley lay out flat and grey with the beck in it, and the roofs of Nether Rivington and, 4 miles off, the smoke of the lime kilns at Kettleby. The ice house was in the north side of the hill, cut into the slope, and if you did not know it was there, you would have walked over the top of it. What you could see from the track was a mound of grass, with 3 thorn trees growing out of it, and a face of stone at the bottom of the mound, half swallowed by ivy, with a doorway in it. The doorway had a stone lintel 11 feet long and a segmental arch of brick above that, and both were sound. The door itself was not. It was oak, in 2 leaves, sheeted on the outside with iron straps, and the bottom 8 inches of it had rotted to fiber, and the iron had swelled and split the wood along the grain. There was a second frame set 2 feet inside the first, and a third beyond that. 3 doors in a row down a short passage, which is how ice houses were built, and which is the first thing Margaret wrote in her book after she had got her breath back from the climb. 3 doors, she wrote. Passage faces north. No sun on the front after 10 in the morning. Pell stood back and let her work the key, and it took her 4 minutes and a great deal of her shoulder. And the lock turned with a sound like a small bone breaking. The first door came outward on its hinges about a foot and then jammed on the sill. The air came out around it. It came out low, along the ground, and it went over her boots and up under her skirt. And it was so cold that she stepped back off the sill without deciding to. Nothing was stored in there since 1842, Pell said behind her. She put her hand into the gap. The dark inside was not the ordinary dark of a shut building. She could feel it on the back of her hand as a weight and a direction, moving, and she put her palm flat against the inner face of the wall and took it off again almost at once, because the stone was colder than the February air behind her by a distance she could not have argued with. It had rained for 3 days. The turf outside was soft, the beck was up, and the thermometer over the saddler's door in the village that morning had stood at 41 degrees, which she knew because she had looked at it, because she looked at that sort of thing. Inside the passage, her breath came out of her white. Here is the question that kept a working woman on that hillside for 4 months in the worst spring the valley had in a decade. And I would like you to hold it in your head, because everything that follows turns on it. How does a building that has been empty for 21 years, with no ice in it, no machinery in it, no fire near it, and nobody living in it, stay colder in February than the February outside it? Put your answer below before she gets to the bottom of the steps, because at the bottom of the steps she found the thing that ruled out the first 3 explanations anybody offers. She got the door past the sill by lifting it on the hinge with her shoulder under the top strap, which is a thing you learn if you have opened a lot of neglected doors. Then there was the second door, which was in better order because it had been protected, and then the third, which was iron-framed and swung easily, and which she left standing open behind her. The passage was 7 feet long. She paced it, and then she measured it with the boxwood rule and wrote the true figure down, 6 feet 11, because pacing is a story, and the rule is a number. At the end of the passage, the floor stopped and the steps began. 11 of them. Stone, worn in the middle, going down and curving slightly to the right, with a rope handrail that had been eaten to a green thread and came apart when she touched it. She had a lantern with her, a common tin one with a horn pane, and it had cost her 1 shilling and 3 in Thirsk Market on the Saturday. The chamber at the bottom was round, and it was bigger than she had expected, and it went on down below the level of the step she was standing on in a smooth bowl of dressed stone, so that she was standing at the lip of something shaped like the inside of an egg. The dome above her was brick, laid in rings that got tighter as they went up, with a plug of stone at the crown. The bowl below her was stone, and the joints in it were so fine that she had to hold the lantern within a hand's breadth of the wall to see them at all. It was empty. There was no ice in it, and there had not been ice in it in her lifetime, and she wants that understood. Because for the rest of the spring, people in the valley said that Margaret Vale had found ice up on the hill, and she never had. What was in it was cold. Her breath stood in front of the lantern in a slow white cloud that drifted down and to the left and did not come back. There was frost on the lower courses of the wall, not everywhere, but in a band about 2 feet high running around the north and east side of the bowl, a gray furred bloom on the stone that came off on her glove and left the stone dark and wet behind it. The iron hooks that were set into the brickwork at the springing of the dome, 8 of them for hanging game, were cold enough that the metal took the warmth out of her fingers in the time it took her to say so. At the very bottom of the bowl, where the floor drew into a small, flat pavement about 5 feet across, there was a puddle of standing water, no bigger than a dinner plate, and around the rim of the puddle there was ice. She went down and crouched over it. The ice was thin, thinner than a shilling, and it was not old ice, because it was clear at the edge, and it had the fine radiating structure of ice that has formed slowly and recently, and when she put the edge of her thumbnail against it, it broke with a sound. Above her, from the doorway at the top of the steps, Pell said something about the light going. She held still, under the pavement, faint, but as plain to her as a clock in another room. There was the sound of running water, not dripping. Dripping has a shape to it, a beat and a gap between beats, and this had neither. It was continuous, and it was low, and it was not underneath her feet in the sense of being in a cellar under the floor, because it was moving sideways. She turned her head and followed it with her ear, and it went from the east side of the bowl away towards the north, in a line, and then it was too faint to hold. There was no other opening in the chamber. She went around the wall with the lantern twice, and there was one door, one flight of steps, one dome with a stone plug in the top of it, and no second entrance, no shaft, no window, no grating. There was no machinery, because there was no machinery in 1863 that could have done this and been carried up that hill. And there was nothing burning, and nothing living, and nothing stored. She put her hand flat on the pavement. The stones were laid in 6 large slabs around a smaller central one, and she went across them one at a time, and the third one from the drain side was colder than the 2 on either side of it. Not much. Enough that she took her hand off it and put it back to be sure, and then took her glove off, and did it again with her skin. She brought the lantern down to the level of the floor and put her cheek near the stone to look along it. The mortar in the joint on the east side of that slab ran dead straight for its whole length, and then, at the point where it met the curve of the bowl, it went on straight instead of following the curve, and it went under the rising wall. Whatever that joint belonged to, it did not belong to the room she was standing in. Pell called down again and told her that the ground would be bad on the track in the dark, and Margaret went up. At the top, she turned around in the passage and stood in the cold moving air for a moment, with her hand on the frame of the iron door. "Sell the stone," Pell said again on the way down the hill. "Ask Croft at the quarry. He will take it off you whole and save you the carting." She asked who Croft was. Pell said that Harlan Croft was the agent for the Kettleby Lime and Stone Company, and that he had been on the hill twice in the last 2 years with a chain and a man to carry it, and that the company had an interest in the limestone under the top field, and had made an offer for it once that the late Duke had refused. Margaret wrote that down that night as well. She wrote, "Croft, Kettleby Lime and Stone, wants the hill." She did not know yet why she was writing it. She wrote things down and then found out later what they were for, which is a slower way of thinking than being clever. And it works. She started measuring on the 16th of February, and she went about it the way she had gone about the butter. She borrowed a thermometer from Silas Ward, the apothecary in Nether Rivington, who was 52 and deaf in one ear, and who lent it to her on the condition that she return it in the same case, which was mahogany and lined with red baize, and worth more than the instrument. It was a spirit thermometer on a boxwood scale, and it was not a good one, but it was consistent, and consistent is what a survey needs. She made a plan of the chamber on a sheet of paper with a compass rose in the corner, and she numbered 11 stations on it. 4 around the wall at shoulder height, 4 around the wall at the floor, 1 in the middle of the pavement, 1 on the bottom step, and 1 in the passage between the second and third doors. She bought a dozen small earthenware cups from a potter's stall at 3d the dozen, and set 1 at each station with an inch of water in it. She cut a tallow candle into lengths and set a piece beside each cup, because tallow goes soft at a temperature she could recognize with her thumb, and it cost her nothing. Then she made her first mistake, and it cost her 9 days. She carried the thermometer down the steps, held it at a station, counted slowly to 60, read it, wrote it, and moved on to the next station. She did the whole 11 in 20 minutes and came up with a set of figures that made no sense at all, because the readings crept upward through the list in the order she had taken them, which meant she was not measuring the room. She was measuring the thermometer coming down to the room and never getting there, plus the heat of her own hand on the boxwood, plus the lantern. She saw it on the 3rd day when she reversed the order of the stations and the figures reversed with it. So she did it properly, which took the rest of the month. She left the instrument at a station for half an hour before she read it, standing back from it with her hands under her shawl and the lantern set on the step behind her. She took 1 station a visit and sometimes 2, and she went up that hill in rain and in sleet, and once in snow that came in sideways off the moor. On the 22nd of February she got wet through and lost a day to a fever and went back up on the 24th. She wrote the outside temperature from the saddler's thermometer every time, and the weather, and the hour, and the state of the ground. By the 4th of March she had a page of figures, and the figures said something she had not expected. The room was not evenly cold. The passage stood at 39 and 40 degrees. The bottom step was 36. The wall stations on the west and south sides ran between 35 and 37, and they moved a little with the weather outside, going up when the valley went up, 3 or 4 days behind it. The wall stations on the north and east sides were 32 and 33, and they did not move with the weather at all. The lowest reading in the whole room was not at the wall, and it was not at the top. It was at the pavement, on the east side, at the 3rd slab, and it went to 31.5 degrees on the 9th of March, when the valley outside was at 48, and the first lambs were out at Netherfold. Cold air sinks. She knew that. Everybody knows that. And it explained the floor being colder than the dome, and it explained precisely nothing about why one side of a round room was 3 degrees colder than the other side of the same round room when both sides were under the same hill. She spent 11 days on the door. It was a good theory, and it was wrong. And she is not embarrassed about it, because you cannot get to the right answer without spending some time being wrong in an organized way. The theory was that the passage faced north and that the more wind came down the hill and through the broken outer door and lay in the chamber the way water lies in a cup, and that the east side was colder because the wind curled that way coming in. So she stopped the outer doorway. She got a sheet of tarred canvas and 11 battens, and she nailed the whole opening shut across the outer frame, and then she stuffed the gap under the middle door with straw from the home farm, for which she paid 1 shilling, and she left the whole thing sealed for 8 days, and did not go in at all. On the 9th day she took the canvas off and went down and read every station. Every station was the same as before, within half a degree, except the passage, which had come up 2 degrees, because she had shut it in. The cold was not coming in through the door. It was already in there, and it was staying, and it was strongest at the floor on the east side, which is where the sound of the water was. She sat on the bottom step for a while with the lantern between her feet. Then she started on the mud. The bowl of the chamber had about 4 inches of silt in the bottom of it, black, greasy, full of the shells of small snails and the bones of 2 birds that had got in at some point and not got out. She took it out with a coal shovel and a bucket, and she carried it up the steps 11 feet at a time, and it took her 3 days. And at the end of the 3 days, her hands were in a state that Peggy Shaw had opinions about. Under the silt, On the east side of the pavement was the drain. It was a proper thing, well made. A stone-lined channel, 8 inches wide, with a dressed curb each side, running from the low point of the pavement out through the base of the wall. It was exactly where the drain of an ice house should be. The whole point of an ice house is that the meltwater has to leave. And it has to leave without letting air come back up the same hole. And every builder who ever cut one into a hillside solved that problem the same way, with a fall to the outside and a trap in it. Margaret cleared the channel back with a stick and a piece of wire. 14 inches in, the drain stopped. It did not silt up, and it did not collapse. It stopped at a face of brickwork that had been built across the channel to fill it completely, laid in 4 courses with the joints staggered. And the brick was not the brick of the vault above her. The vault brick was thin and pale and sandy, the kind they burned in the valley in the last century. This was a hard red brick, larger, machine-pressed, with a sharp arris on it, and the mortar was gray and full of ash. It was newer. She had seen brick like it in the new stable range at the hall, which had been built, according to the date stone she had walked past 40 times without reading, in 1841. Nobody blocks a drain by accident. A drain fails by filling, and a filled drain has mud in it. And the mud has a shape, and this had no mud behind the stick, because there was nothing behind the stick but the brick. Somebody had gone down into that chamber with a hod of new brick and a bucket of mortar, and they had built a wall inside the drain, and then they had gone away and let the roof over the passage fall in. Margaret put her ear against the brick. The water was behind it, and it was louder there than anywhere else in the room, and it was not coming towards her, and it was not going away from her. It was crossing. She did not take the brick out. She wanted to, and she went so far as to borrow a cold chisel from the blacksmith, and then she put it down on the pavement and sat looking at the wall for the better part of an hour. A thing that was built on purpose has a reason, and if you knock it down before you know the reason, you have destroyed your only piece of evidence and gained a hole. So she went at it the other way, through paper. Ambrose Pell refused her twice. The first time he told her that the estate books were the estate's business, and that she had no interest in them. The second time, on the steps of the estate office, with rain coming off the gutter behind him, he told her that she had been left a ruin out of an old man's sentiment, and that the kindest thing she could do for herself was to take Croft's money and go back into service before the summer places were all filled. So she went to Reuben Sharp in Thirsk and paid him 6 shillings and 8 pence for half an hour of his time. And she asked him one question, which was whether a person who owns a parcel has any right to see the estate's papers touching that parcel. Sharp took his spectacles off and thought about it for longer than she expected. Documents of title, he said. Plans, conveyances, and any account of works done upon the parcel itself. Not the general accounts. You may ask. And if they refuse you in writing, I shall want to see the letter. Pell did not refuse her in writing. He gave her 4 afternoons in the muniment room at the hall, from 2 until 4, with the door open and himself in the passage outside, pretending to be doing something else, and she took her book and her pencil, and she went through the shelves in the only order that ever works, which is 1 shelf at a time from the left. The muniment room was on the north side of the hall and had a stone floor and 1 window with wire in the glass. The books were on their sides in runs, bound in vellum and in half-calf, with the years on the spines in ink that had gone brown, and the estate accounts ran without a gap from 1764. There was a smell of cold paper and mouse. She found the first thing on the second afternoon, in the account book for 1818, on a page of works and repairs written in a clerk's small upright hand. Stonework at Rivington Hill, £38 12 shillings. She wrote it down and went on. And 4 lines below it, in the same hand, in the same month, there was a second entry. Stone conduit and shielding arch, Rivington Hill, £61 4 shillings. She read that twice and then a third time. £61 was not a repair. £61 in 1818 was more than the estate had spent that year on the whole of the stables, and it was nearly 3 times what it had spent on repairing the roof of the mill. A conduit is a channel for water. A shielding arch is a vault built over something to take the weight of the ground off it and keep it from being crushed. You do not build a shielding arch over nothing, and you do not spend £61 on a hillside that has no house on it and no mill on it, and nothing on it at all, but an ice house that was already 27 years old. And the entry did not say ice house. She went back through 1816 and 1817 and forward through 1819 and 1820, and the ice house appeared in the books where it should appear, in ordinary small sums, dos rions, a lock, hauling ice up from the ponds in January at so much the load. Those entries said ice house. The 2 big entries in 1818 did not. They said Rivington Hill, and they said conduit, and they were written by the same clerk on the same page as a bill for gate hinges. On the 3rd afternoon, she found the name. The works accounts for 1818 had a summary of tradesmen paid at the back, ruled in columns, and against the 2 Rivington Hill entries there was one name written twice, to T. Vale, mason. She sat with her hand flat on the page. There had been Vales in that valley for a long time, and she knew it. But she also knew her own line, because her grandfather had told it to her while he worked. The way men of that sort tell things, without looking up. Thomas Vale, born in 1790, apprentice to his own father, who had been a mason at Rivington before him. In 1818, Thomas Vale was 28 years old. Her grandfather had built whatever was under that floor. She looked for him again after that, and she found him all through the books, in 1s and 2s and half-crowns, 40 years of a man's working life in a column, garden walls and a bridge parapet, and a well-head at the home farm and the piers of the West Gate. And then, in the account book for 1842, in the last full year of works before the ice house went out of use altogether, she found this, to T. Vale, mason. Stopping and making good at the ice house. £1 11 shillings. Stopping. A mason says stopping when he means filling a hole so that it stays filled. Her grandfather had built the thing, and 24 years later her grandfather had walled up the drain, and 2 years after that he had died in his bed at Ellerbeck, with his rule in the pocket of his coat, and nobody in the family had ever once mentioned any of it to anybody, including to her. Pell put his head round the door at 4 o'clock and said that was the time. She asked him, on the way out, whether he had ever seen a plan of the ice house. He said there was none, and that there had never been one, and that half the buildings on the estate had no plan and never had. And she thanked him, and did not tell him what she had found, and she has thought since that this was the first decision she made that mattered. The mystery had moved. On the 11th of February, it had been a question about weather. By the end of March, it was a question about her own family, and the 2 questions had different shapes, because a building can be strange by accident, and a man cannot. Why did her grandfather build a stone channel under a duke's ice house, and why, at the end of his life, did he seal it up? Harlan Croft came to see her on the 2nd of April. He was 46, a heavy, well-made man in a good coat, and he came to the saddler's shop in the village and asked for Miss Vale, and stood in the road rather than come up, which Peggy Shaw noticed and mentioned for a week. He had a folded plan under his arm, and a man with him carrying a surveyor's chain, and he was polite from the first word to the last. The Kettleby Lime and Stone Company, he said, had an interest in the limestone in the upper part of Rivington Hill. The company would in due course be treating with his grace for the top field and the moor edge. The icehouse parcel lay below all that and was of no consequence to the workings. But the track was the only way up from the road, and it would be a convenience to the company to have the whole of the lower ground in one hand. He offered her £40. Margaret asked him what the company would do with the hill. "Take the limestone out of it," he said. "Down to the water, in benches, over about 9 years. She asked him what he meant by down to the water. "There is water in limestone," he said. "There is always water in limestone. You go down until you meet it, and then you stop, or you pump, and pumping costs money, so mostly you stop. She said she would think about the offer, and she wrote the whole conversation in her book that night. All of it, including the phrase "down to the water," and she underlined that, and she still did not know why. Croft came back on the 19th with £60, and on the 4th of May with 80. On the 4th of May he also said at the end, in exactly the same pleasant voice, that he had taken counsel's opinion on the words in the will, and that the ground immediately about it was not a description that any court would enforce. He said that a parcel without a boundary was a parcel without a title, and that this could be a very long business for a woman living on savings. That was the day Margaret stopped thinking of the hill as a problem and started thinking of it as a possession. The rain came at the end of the first week in May, 3 days of it, hard and straight down, and the beck came up over the stepping stones at Netherfold and took a footbridge out at Ellerbeck, and on the 9th of May, when Margaret came up the track with her lantern and her book, the ground behind the ice house had moved. The mound over the chamber ran back into the hillside, and the hill continued up behind it, and between the mound and the rising ground there had always been a shallow dip full of nettles and ivy and one elder tree. The dip was now a hole. About 4 yards of the bank had come away and slid, and the elder had gone over sideways with its roots in the air, and at the back of the slip, where the soil had peeled off the rock, there was a face of dressed stone. She got down into it on her hands and knees in the wet clay. It was a small square structure, a shaft head, 2 feet 6 inches across the outside, built of the same fine ashlar as the bowl of the chamber, and it had a stone cap on it, with an iron ring set in the middle, and the cap had been mortared down, and the mortar had failed on one side. The whole of it had been under about 3 feet of soil, and 100 years of ivy, 22 yards uphill, and east of the ice house door. She put her hand over the gap where the mortar had failed. Air was coming up out of it, and the air was cold, and it was moving steadily enough to make the ivy leaf she held over it stand out and stay out. She did not open it that day. She went down to Nether Rivington and found Jonas Blake. Jonas Blake was 61 and had been a mason all his life, the same as Thomas Vale, and had worked with him as a young man on the gate piers at the West Lodge. He had a shed behind the chapel and a bad hip and a granddaughter of 19 named Alice Denby, who brought him his dinner and who talked the entire time she was in the shed and had nothing whatever to do with any of this. Margaret asked Blake what he would want to lift a mortared capstone off a shaft head, 22 yards up a wet hill, without breaking it. Blake said he would want 2 shillings, a boy, and a length of oak 4 inches by 4. They did it on the 11th. The boy was Tobias Gant's lad from Holland Farm. They cut the failed mortar out of the joint with a chisel all the way round, which took 2 hours, and then they levered the cap up on the oak with a stone under it and slid it clear, and Blake put his hand on the wall of the shaft and looked down and said one word, which was well. Margaret asked him what he meant. "That is not a well," he said. "A well is round. That is squared and coursed, and it has a stair in it." The shaft went down 11 feet. It was not a stair so much as a set of stone footings projecting from the wall, staggered, the kind of thing a working man puts in so that he can get down and back up again with a bucket. At the bottom, the shaft opened sideways into a passage. The cold came up the shaft at them the whole time they were looking at it, and the boy, who was 14, said it was like standing at an open cellar in January, and Blake told him to hold the lantern still. Margaret went down first because it was hers. The passage was 4 feet 3 inches high and 2 feet 9 wide, and she went along it bent over with the lantern held low in front of her and her shoulder against the wall. It ran west, back towards the ice house, under the line of an old retaining wall that she had walked past 40 times and had assumed was a field boundary. The floor was dry and swept clean by the air. The walls were laid in courses so regular that she stopped once and put the boxwood rule against them and found the courses were 6 inches to a stone, all the way, without a break. 21 yards in, by her pacing, and afterwards by the rule, the passage widened into a chamber the size of a small pantry, and the air in it was the coldest air she had ever stood in that was not outdoors in a hard winter. There was no chest in it. There was no box, no bag, no gold, no bones, and nothing at all that a person would call treasure. And she wants that understood too, because the valley said afterwards that Margaret Vale had found the Duke's money on the hill, and there was never any money on that hill. What there was, running along the north side of the little chamber and out through both walls, was a channel of masonry 2 feet wide, covered for most of its length with flat stone slabs, with one length of about a yard left open and a stone curb around the opening. The channel was full of water. The water was running west to east, without a sound in the open part, and with a low, steady note where it went back under the slabs, and it was as clear as glass, and when Margaret put 2 fingers into it, she took them out again immediately and could not feel the ends of them for a minute and a half. Blake came down after her and stood bent under the roof and looked at the channel for a long time. "Whose is that?" he said. She said she did not know yet. "That is your grandfather's coursing," he said, and put his hand on the wall. It took her 9 days after that to understand what she was looking at, and she did not understand it by thinking. She understood it by walking. She put the thermometer in the open length of the channel on the 12th of May and left it there, and came back at noon the next day, and the water stood at 36 degrees. She went back on the 20th, and it stood at 38. She went back on the 2nd of June, when the valley was at 66 degrees, and the hay was half up at Netherfold, and the water stood at 41, and on the 18th of July, in the hottest week of that summer, with the road dust standing in the air behind every cart, it stood at 44.5. The valley moved 30 degrees between February and July. The water moved 11. Then she walked the hill. She went up above the ice house, past the slip and the fallen elder, up through the top field where the company wanted its limestone, and out onto the moor edge. She did it 4 times in June with the plan in her book and a ball of string in her pocket. On the 4th time she found it, in a hollow of rushes about 600 yards above and west of the ice house, where a small beck came down off the peat. The beck was called Holland Syke. It ran down over the peat, perhaps 200 yards, and then it reached the place where the peat gave out, and the limestone came to the surface in gray ribs, and then it went into the ground. It did not spread and soak away. It went in, at a hole under an overhang of rock about the size of a cartwheel, with a noise, all of it, and below that hole the channel of the beck went on down the hillside, dry and stony and full of moss, the way a beck channel looks when it has not had water in it for 100 years. Margaret stood there for a while. Then she went back down and got Jonas Blake's boy and a sack of chaff, and she put the chaff into the swallow hole at the top. Then she went down and sat in the little chamber under the retaining wall with a lantern and watched the open length of the channel. At 11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, the water in front of her turned dirty and began to carry chaff. That is the whole of it. And it is not magic, and it is not luck, and there is nothing under that hill that could not be found by anybody who was willing to be cold and wet for 4 months. Water comes down off the moor. It goes into the limestone at Holland Syke. Limestone takes water in and carries it, in channels of its own that the water has cut over a very long time, and it carries it away from the sun and away from the air, under 300 feet of hill. Water in that state does not warm up in summer, because there is nothing up there to warm it, and it does not freeze in winter, because the hill above it holds a little heat. So it comes through the inside of that hill within a few degrees of the same temperature every day of the year. And in February, when the moor is running off snow and the Syke is taking in half-melted ice, it comes through very cold indeed. Somebody in 1791 had known that. Somebody had watched that beck disappear, and had understood what it meant, and had chosen the site for the Duke's ice house for a reason that had nothing to do with the north slope or with the hill being handy to the hall, which it was not. They put it where they put it because at that particular point, 11 feet under the floor of the chamber, the water was already there. They cut down to it, They built the bowl of the ice house directly over the watercourse, with a floor of dressed slabs, and no more than a course of stone between the underside of that floor and the top of the channel. They gave the chamber the deep bed of earth over the dome, the triple doors, the north face, the drain with its fall. All the ordinary things every ice house had. Then underneath all the ordinary things they laid the one thing that no other ice house in the north of England had, which was a stream of moor water crossing the floor slab all day and all night for 170 years. It took the heat out of the stone, the way a hand takes the heat out of a warm cup. Ice put into that chamber lasted. It lasted through August and into the next winter. And the account said, so if you read them properly, because Rivington bought ice for the hall in only 11 of the 22 winters between 1820 and 1842, and Margaret had copied those figures without knowing what they meant. And when the ice stopped coming, the water did not stop. That is why an empty building on an empty hill, with no ice in it, and nobody in it was still, in February of 1863, colder inside than out. By 1818, the channel of the water had shifted or fallen in somewhere under the hill, which is what water in limestone does, and the ice house had begun to fail, and the estate had paid £61 and 4 shillings to a mason of 28 named Thomas Vale to go down after it. He cut the shaft. He drove the passage under the line of the retaining wall. He found the water where it had gone, and he took it in hand and led it back in 2 feet of dressed masonry, with a shielding arch over the top to carry the weight of the hill, and he set the whole of it so square and so tight that 45 years later a lantern showed no daylight in a joint. And in 1842, when the hall gave up on ice and the last load went in and the doors began to rot, the same man came back for £1 11 shillings and walled up the drain. A drain with a fall in it is a way in. The thing at the bottom of that drain had stopped being a meltwater channel years before, and it was by then the open top of a watercourse that the whole hill drank from, and he was not going to leave it lying open to the vermin and the muck of a building nobody was going to look after any more. He stopped it, and he made it good, and he went home, and he told nobody, and 2 years later, he died. Margaret sat on the bottom step of the ice house with all of that in her book in pencil and read it back to herself twice, and then wrote one more line underneath. Why did he leave it to me? She got the answer on the 8th of July, in Reuben Sharp's office in Thirsk. And she got it because of something she had copied down in the muniment room in March and had not understood, and had copied anyway. On her last afternoon in that room, she had found a slim book of memoranda, bound in limp vellum, covering the years 1816 to 1824. In it, under the date of the 4th of March, 1819, there was a note of an indenture made between the second Duke of Rivington of the one part and himself of the other part. That had puzzled her until Sharp explained that a man may do it that way when he is separating one piece of his own land from the rest of it and wants the arrangement to survive him. The note said that there was granted to the parcel called the Ice House at Rivington Hill, and to the owner of that parcel for the time being, the water of Holland Syke and free passage thereof through the hill, and that the owner or occupier of the upper lands should do nothing to divert, foul, take, or interrupt the said water. Sharp read the whole of Margaret's copy of it, and then he sent his clerk up to the hall to see the original. The original was where she said it was, and the clerk came back at 4 o'clock with a certified extract. Sharp put it on the desk in front of him and looked at it, and said the first thing Margaret had heard from a professional man in 5 months that was not about her getting out of the way. This is a very good grant, he said. He explained it to her twice, because she made him. The parcel she owned did not merely sit on the hill. It carried a right, older than the railway and older than the Kettleby Company, to that water and to the passage of that water through the hill. And the right ran with the land, and it bound whoever held the upper ground. If the Kettleby Lime and Stone Company took the top field down in benches to the water, as Harlan Croft had told her to her face in the road outside the saddler's shop that they intended to do, They would cut the roof off that watercourse, and the syke would be gone. Into the workings, out at the quarry sump, down the beck at Kettleby and away. They could not do that. Not without her. And that was why a dying man had written a sentence into his will in October of 1862 that made 14 people in a long room look at their shoes. Margaret understood the rest of it in the days that followed, partly from Sharp and partly from an old land agent's letter that Sharp unearthed from the file of the 1859 negotiation. The third Duke had been offered £11,000 for the moor edge and the top field in 1859, and he had refused it. And his family had not been told why, and by 1862, his family were counting the years he had left, and the offer was going to be made again to somebody less obstinate. He could not tell them the reason. If he had told them, the water right would have become a thing to be bought out, argued over, released for a consideration, extinguished quietly by a family that wanted £11,000 and had never in their lives put a hand on that stone. So he did the other thing. He took the one parcel that carried the right, and he gave it away from the estate entirely to somebody outside the family before he died. He chose the last person in the valley whose name was Vale, because it had been the Vales who built it and the Vales who kept it, and because a woman who had spent her life counting things in other people's houses was, in his judgment, the sort of person who would go and look. He was right about that. The rest of it, in his sentence, was never the ice. There had not been ice in that hill for 21 years, and he knew it better than anybody. The rest of it was the water and the hill, and every well and spring and trough below the line of that stone channel, and he had put it in her hands in 11 words, and left her to find out what they meant. She sat in the office in Thirsk, with her hands in her lap. Then she asked Sharp what it would cost to have the extract enrolled and a copy sent to the Kettleby Lime and Stone Company. £2 2 shillings, he said, and postage. A water right does not buy bread. Margaret had £8 1 shilling and 9 pence left at the end of the second week in July, and a hole in a hillside with a rotten door on it, and she had until about October before she would have to go back into service in somebody's house in Leeds and let the whole of it fall in behind her. So she went at it the way she had gone at everything else, which was with a list and a price against every line. The first thing was the drain. And the first thing about the drain was that she was not going to touch her grandfather's brickwork. The chamber had to shed its water somewhere, because a room at 44 degrees with a wet floor is a room that grows mold, and she had already worked out that the water on the pavement was not leaking up from the channel but running down the walls out of the ground above. So she had Jonas Blake cut a new outfall, a fresh channel from the low point of the pavement, out through the base of the north wall, and down 4 yards to daylight in the slip where the elder had fallen, with a fall of 1 inch in 3 feet, and a slate trap at the outer end so the air could not come back up it. It took him and the boy 6 days. It cost her £4 12 shillings and 6 pence, including the slate, which was more than half of everything she had. The doors cost her £3 7 shillings, and she got them cheap because the outer pair were made from the old granary doors at Holland Farm, cut down and rehung by a carpenter named Ephraim Spate, who was 38, and who charged her nothing for the second visit because his wife had opinions about the estate. She took the ivy off the face. She turfed the slip back over the shaft head and set a stone grating into the cap with an iron frame, because she wanted the shaft open now, and that turned out to matter. Then she went and asked Hester Rowe for her butter. Hester Rowe was 55 and farmed 140 acres at Netherfold with 2 sons, and she made between 90 and 110 pounds weight of butter a week in the summer, and she stood in her own dairy doorway with her arms folded and listened to the whole proposal without saying anything at all. The problem she had was the problem every farm in that valley had between June and September, which was that butter made on Tuesday had to go to Thirsk on Saturday, and it went soft on Wednesday. And soft butter took 8 pence a pound, where firm butter took 11 pence, and the difference across a summer was more money than most of them saw in a year. "Twopence a crock a week," Margaret said. "You bring it. You fetch it. I keep it cold and dry, and I keep a book of what is yours. Roe sent up 14 crocks on the 24th of July, and Margaret lost 11 of them. She had put them on the pavement because the pavement was the coldest part of the room, and she had 4 months of her own figures proving it. What her figures did not say, because she had never thought to measure it, was that the pavement was also the wettest part of the room, and that the stone over a channel of running water sweats. She went down on the 31st with her lantern and found the crocks standing in a film of water, and the butter under the cloths gone gray at the edge with a bloom on it, and 3 of them were still fit, and the rest were fit for nothing. She paid Hester Roe £3 2 shillings that afternoon, in coin, on the kitchen table at Netherfold, which was the market value of £98 weight of butter, and was better than a third of the money she had left in the world. Roe counted it, and put it in her apron, and asked whether Margaret was going to give it up. No, Margaret said. Then send for the next lot on Friday, Roe said. She rebuilt the inside in 11 days. Blake set 9 stone piers on the pavement, and she bought slate shelves off a builder in Thirsk who was breaking up a fishmonger's, 4 shillings a slab, 11 slabs, and they went on the piers 18 inches clear of the floor, with a gap of 4 inches behind them at the wall. Then she opened the shaft. That was the part she was proudest of, and it was the part that cost the least. The shaft head up the hill was 22 yards away and 11 feet deep, and it stood in the passage where the cold air lay, and when she took the cap off, air moved. So she put a wooden louvre in the grating and ran the passage door on a latch that could stand at 4 settings. By opening one and shutting the other, she could pull a slow draft of that cold, dry air through the little chamber, along the passage, up the shaft, and out. It took the damp off the slate shelves within 2 days, and it never afterwards let it come back. Total outlay, £1 3 shillings and 4 pence. Most of it for the ironwork on the Louvre. The second lot from Netherfold went in on the 14th of August, 22 crocks, and came out on the 19th hard enough to take a thumbprint and no more. Roe's butter fetched 11 pence at Thirsk on the 22nd. By the last week in September there were 9 farms sending, and by the following June there were 19, and Margaret was taking £2 15 shillings a week in storage rents in the summer months and about 14 shillings through the winter. On the 11th of October, 1863, she signed her first contract with Beckwith and Sons, provision merchants, of Kirkgate in Thirsk, to hold and deliver not less than 120 pounds weight of butter a week, from the 1st of May to the 30th of September, at a charge of 1 penny the pound, the whole to be kept at not above 46 degrees, and a book of temperatures to be produced on demand. She produced the book of temperatures. She had 412 readings in it by then, and she had never once missed a day. Harlan Croft came up the hill on the 4th of August, 1864. The company had by then had the certified extract of the grant of 1819 in its hands for nearly a year, and had had counsel look at it twice. It had made her an offer of £350 in November and an offer of £600 in March, and she had refused both in writing, in 11 words the second time, on paper that cost her a penny. The negotiation for the top field and the moor edge had gone off in April. The 4th Duke's own solicitors had advised him that he could not sell the upper ground free of the water right, and that he could not extinguish it without the owner of the icehouse parcel, and the owner of the icehouse parcel was not selling. The 4th of August was the hottest day of that summer. There were 68 men cutting oats in the valley bottom, and the road up from the home farm stood in dust to the ankle, and Croft came up it on foot in his good coat with his hat in his hand, and Ambrose Pell came up it behind him, and they arrived at the icehouse door at 3:20 in the afternoon. Tobias Gant's cart was standing at the door with the horse in the shade of the thorn trees. Gant was 35 now, and he had his sleeves up, and he was carrying crocks 2 at a time down the steps to Alice Denby, who had come to work for Margaret in the spring at 5 shillings a week, and who counted them in and called the number up the passage. Margaret was standing at the foot of the steps with the book open on her arm, writing. Croft came down the passage through the 3 doors and stopped on the bottom step. The temperature in the chamber that afternoon was 43 degrees. Outside it was 79. He had walked 2 miles in the sun, and he came into that room, and he stopped as if somebody had put a hand on his chest. And Margaret watched him do it. And so did Alice Denby. And so did Tobias Gant, who told the story in the Black Bull for about 9 years afterwards. The slate shelves were full. There were 240 crocks on them that day, with a card on each and a name on each card. And the air off the shaft was moving along the passage steadily enough to lift the corner of the paper in Margaret's book. Croft looked at the shelves for a while. Then he asked her what the room stood at. 43, she said. He nodded, and he put his hat back on, and he said good afternoon, and he went up the steps and out. He did not make a fourth offer. The Kettleby Lime and Stone Company opened its bench on the far side of the valley at Ellerbeck 2 years later, in a hill with no water in it. And Harlan Croft did not come up Rivington Hill again. Ambrose Pell had not come down at all. He was standing at the top of the passage in the light of the doorway, with his hat in his hand, in the cold air coming past him out of the hill, and Margaret came up and stood beside him. And neither of them said anything for a moment. He had been the man who priced the walls at £18. He was still steward. He had another 6 years of it in him. That is a good draft, he said at last. It is my grandfather's, she said. She had written the first line in the storage book on the 24th of July, 1863, at the top of the first page, before there was anything to put under it, and it was not her own sentence. And she did not pretend it was. Measure it twice and write it down, or all you have got is a story. Under it, in the same pencil, was the first entry. Nether Fold. 14 crocks, 2d the crock, in the 24th, out the 29th. 11 of those 14 went into the pig bucket and cost her £3, 2 shillings. And she never ruled that line out of the book. And it was still there. Second from the top of the page, when the book was full, Margaret Vale was 31 years old, out of a place, with £9 and 4 shillings in a tea tin, when 14 people in a warm room laughed at what a dead man had left her. She spent 1 shilling and 3d of it on a tin lantern, and 6d a week on lamp oil, and 6 shillings and 8d on half an hour with a solicitor, and she carried a borrowed thermometer up a wet hill in the dark for 4 months to find out why one flagstone was colder than the one beside it. Nothing else she ever bought paid her back the way those small sums did.